You are listening to the Tricorder Transmissions Special Episode 37.
Thanks for beaming aboard the Tricorder Transmissions for our 37th supplemental log. I am Jeff Hewlett. Tonight we are coming to you with some extremely exciting Star Trek news, and here to tell us all about it is Saturn Award-winning author of the incredible These Are The Voyages book series and four-time returning guest to the show, Mr. Marc Cushman. Welcome back, sir.
Hi, Jeff. And he's not joking when he says beams in. I just beamed in.
You did.
I got my arm is sticking out of my kneecap, though. I think we made a mistake somewhere.
Uh-oh. I got to get a hold of Mr. Scott and see if he can put you back together.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we get for beaming you from those high altitudes that you're living in now.
Yeah. I'm up in the mountains, as you know, but nobody listens knows because we were talking beforehand. I came up to the mountains to write this book. Too many distractions down there in the city.
Yeah, I mean, we were chatting over email before about this, and you said you're working on two books at a time.
Yeah, I usually do. Because, you know, as much as you may love your subject, and you've seen how detailed my books are,
Yes,
you get a little burned out after a while. And I mean, it takes a year to write one of these things. And if I'm just doing that and nothing but that, you know, after about 6 months, I start craving to do anything differently just to shake it up. So what I do is I'll write two different books at the same time, research two different at the same time. So I'll spend half a day on one, half a day on the other. But then as I start getting up to the deadline, and my publisher keeps saying, "Where's the manuscript?" Then I'll start shifting more over to the one that's due. So this fourth Star Trek book, I actually started that about a year and a half ago, and it's about a third done now. But they want it in late May, so it can be out August 1st of next year.
oh right,
And that
time for
means
the convention, yeah.
yeah, and that means it's ready to go to print in late May, so it needs to go through editing and proofing and everything else. So I'm going to have to start turning in some chapters soon.
Wow.
So yeah, I'll probably be shifting more to just working on that as each month goes by. But right now, I'm still kind of playing around with two different projects.
Yeah. So for the audience listening out there, we're talking about back on October 14th, I got an email from Jacobs Brown Press announcing that you're working on the fourth book in the These Are the Voyages series, and this one is entitled Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
You know, we have three books out prior to this, each one for one season of the original series. Was it always a plan to continue the series beyond the original three series?
No, it wasn't even a plan that the first one was going to be a 3-book set. It was a plan that it was going to be a 1 book, a single book. And the more I researched and the more I dug into everything, you know, they kept saying, "What's the page count?" I said, "Well, we're up to about 800 pages now without pictures." And they said, "Well, then it's going to have to be 2 books." And then, "Okay, Cushman, what's the page count?" We're up to about 1,400 pages now without pictures. Okay, it's going to be 3 books. And that's how that ended up being a 3-book set, one for each season. And their editors came in. Susan Osborne was the editor on those 3 books, and she came in with a mandate to chop. And she went through these things, and she cut a sentence here and cut maybe half a paragraph there. But she wasn't really able to cut any pages out. And, you know, she just said, there's no fat here. This is all pertinent, relevant, interesting stuff. And the thing about Susan is she wasn't a Star Trek fan. I mean, she was not a non-fan. She'd seen the show, she had liked the show, but she didn't watch it religiously. And so she was finding out about Star Trek without having seen many of these episodes. And that's why they assigned her on the assignment, because they thought, well, she's not going to let anything that's not too interesting get by. And yet she was letting everything stay. So they went for 3 books. And you've read them. There's no fat in there, right?
Not at all. Yes, I've read all 3 cover to cover, and you actually were kind enough to personalize all 3 of them for me. So they are treasured books in my Star Trek collection, that's for sure. Probably among my favorite Trek books of all time.
It's funny. Susan came out to the first 2 conventions we did in Vegas in August of 2013 when the first book came out, and August of 2014 when the second book came out. And a lot of people who had read the first book came back during the second convention, and they were a little hostile toward her because they had heard that she had cut maybe 10%. And they were saying, we want that 10%. And so now Mark Alfred just finished editing my Lost in Space books, and that's a 3-books set as well. And it was supposed to be 1 book, and then it went to 2. And he was under the same mandate to cut. And he would write back, and I'd say, Mark, you only cut out maybe half a page in this 15-page chapter. And he'd say, yeah, but, everything in there the fans are going to want to know. So, I don't think that there's wasted stuff in these books. That's what I discovered, and I was as surprised as anybody. I mean, when I started digging through these books, Jeff, it was through the boxes that Gene Roddenberry gave to me, and the stuff at UCLA, and the stuff Bob Justman gave to me, and so many other people. It was like finding gold, like in being in a cave and chipping away, and here's another big chunk of gold. And whenever I would find these things, it was like, my God, this is incredible. This story is even richer than I ever thought, and it's got to go in the book. And so the books just got bigger and bigger. So you have a chapter on every episode, and most of these chapters are 15 pages long. I think the one on City on the Edge of Forever is over 20.
Yep.
But for anybody who hasn't read these books, I write the clutch pedals. I try not to talk any more than necessary. I let Gene Roddenberry do the talking, and Bob Justman and Dorothy Fontana and Gene Kuhn, either through the interviews I did, but mostly through the memos that they wrote. Because that, to me, is the exciting stuff, to read those memos, read them having a conversation with each other at the time that they were making the show on every single episode. It's like you're sitting in a room surrounded by the 2 Genes and Bob Justman and Dorothy Fontana, and listening to them talk about the latest script that just came in. And how are we going to produce this? And what do we need to change to be able to produce it? And here's the letter from Stan Robertson at NBC. What are they going to give us trouble over?
Yeah.
And you go through this with every episode, and then you watch that episode again. Read a chapter, watch the episode, and it's really, for me, it made watching the show new again for me. I thought, well, I've seen Trouble with Tribbles 20 times in my life, but I feel like I've only seen it 2 or 3 times now because I'm seeing it through fresh eyes.
Yeah, I agree. The chapter on the alternative factor changed my mind about that episode, having known what happened behind the scenes and what actually wound up getting on screen. It was pretty incredible, the difference.
Yeah, those were the ones I enjoyed the most. Some people have asked me what my favorite chapters are, and they're not necessarily my favorite episodes.
Right.
But I loved I loved finding out what went wrong with a handful of the episodes that didn't turn out great, because most Star Trek episodes are great, or some are greater than others, but most are great. But there's a handful of them that just, you go, what went wrong? And it's the same talented people making this. So how come this one fell on its face? And usually NBC is behind what went wrong.
Yep.
And that one, if anybody hasn't read these books, we can tell them. Matter of fact, I think the chapter is up on the Jacobs Brown website. I think you can read that chapter even if you don't have the book. You just go to thesearethevoyagesbooks.com, and it's part of their websites. And there's various chapters there you can read. But that one, they had John Drew Barrymore, who was going to play Lazarus, and he was a big, big star. That's Drew Barrymore's dad. And he wanted to do the script, and this was going to be the episode that was going to feature the first interracial kiss. Star Trek ended up doing it 3 years later, or 2 years later, for Plato's Stepchildren, but they were going to do it during the first season. And NBC didn't realize it because they knew John Drew Barrymore had been cast, and everybody was very excited about that. They knew they were going to get a close-up listening TV guide with him in the episode and everything else. And the woman playing Lieutenant Matthews, I believe her name was, or Masters. Do you know Masters or Matthews? One of those two. Was Janet McLaughlin. Well, she hadn't done hardly any TV. She had done mostly stage work. And so NBC didn't know who she was. But her name was Janet McLaughlin. Oh, a Scottish woman, huh? She was black. She was African American. And the minute they found out, they blew a television tube, and Gene Coon was told just a couple days before that episode was going to start filming, either get rid of her or take out all the love scenes where Lazarus is seducing her to get the diamond and crystals, which was a big part of the episode. And Gene Coon, bless his heart, who was a very moral man and a very good man, was, as you find from reading his memos, was not going to fire an actress because of the color of her skin. So he gutted the script, sadly. And John Drew Barrymore was sitting in the makeup chair a day later, reading the latest draft that just came out that morning, and he's saying, "This isn't what I agreed to do." And he gets up and he walks. And they're trying to start filming, and suddenly Lazarus isn't there. And Shatner was the guy who came forward and said, "Hey, I know a really good actor who I did a pilot with a couple of years ago named Robert Brown, and I know he's not working today because it's his birthday. and here's his number. I got his number." So they called Robert Brown and talked him into coming into Desert Blue Studios from Malibu, and he drove the hour, left his party, came in there. Gene Roddenberry put an arm around him and started walking him towards makeup and said, "Well, here's the script. I'm taking you to makeup. They're going to put this stringy beard on you and all that kind of stuff." And he says, "Wait a minute. I thought I was just coming in to talk about doing a role." And he says, "Oh, no, we started filming this morning. And we booked you a motel across the street because we know you live out in Malibu." And, and so it was kind of like dominoes falling, Jeff. You know, when that first domino tips,
Yep.
and you got a row of dominoes, look out. It's just dominoes are going to just keep falling and falling and falling. So they were doing catch up for the entire 7 days they were filming. Robert Brown hadn't seen a single episode of Star Trek. He didn't even know what Star Trek was. They were making up his makeup as they went along. That's why some scenes the beard is thicker and others it's stringy.
Yep.
You know, I mean, it was just, and the script was being rewritten as they were going along, and all the really good stuff. I mean, the best scenes in the script had been pulled out, and now you just have Lazarus falling off of a bunch of rocks, and you know, it just was disjointed. So you read that chapter and you find out, and as you said, I agree with you. After you read that chapter, you respect the episode more because you know what they were trying to do. But you can even enjoy it more because it's, you know, the deepness of the story. You can pretend that maybe you walked out to get a sandwich and you missed 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you feel that stuff is in there, and it all makes sense now.
Exactly. So this gives you guys out there in listener land a really good idea of what's in these first 3 books, and you have the better part of a year to pick those books up and read them before the 4th one that Mark is working on now is coming out. And you've already talked a little bit about the research that you did, and on the previous episodes that we've done together, you talked a lot about the research process for these books. Is the 4th book, do you use the same research process? Did you approach it the same way?
Yes. Now I'm going to be honest. We have not gotten a hold of Gene Roddenberry's memos yet, because we're doing this book covers. It starts with Star Trek's cancellation, and Gene goes over and makes Pretty Maids all in a row, and then he does his 1970s TV pilots, Spectre and Questor tapes and Earth 2. And Star Trek is gaining popularity and syndication. Well, we know from the 3 books you've already read that it was doing very well on NBC. And all that folklore that's been on the internet for 50 years is finally slowly getting corrected, because we licensed, I say we, Jacobs Brown licensed all the Nielsen ratings for every single episode. It cost them $15,000, 15,000. So you can buy these 3 books for less than $100, and you can have all the information they paid $15,000 to get. So they have the Nielsen ratings report for every single episode. And you see that Star Trek is NBC's top-rated Thursday night show. They move it to Fridays. It's their top-rated Friday night show, and yet they try to cancel it. And it took this write-in campaign and marches against NBC to embarrass them into renewing it, because the press was covering all this. So it's in the newspapers, it's on the radio, it's on TV. And they had been telling their stockholders that, the show's been underperforming. Well, a million protesters? Come on, So they had to pick it up for a third year. So they put it to the death slot, Friday nights at 10 p.m. The first episode, Spock's Brain, won its time slot. And opposite it was the 2-hour premiere of Hawaii Five-0, a 2-hour movie. And this is a show that went for 12 seasons. It was a top 10 hit for 12 seasons. And Spock's Brain kicked its ass. So the ratings were not as good during the third season as the previous two, but it's in this horrible, horrible time slot. The fact is, for that time slot, it was doing respectable business for the network. But their mandate was that there would be no fourth season. And they made that very clear from the get-go, as you see when you read these books, from the various memos and so forth. So, and they tricked the fans at the end of the third season when they were expecting the write-in campaign, because they'd been through it 1 year earlier. So when the letters started coming, they would send out this form letter saying, don't worry, Star Trek will be returning to the NBC schedule. We're happy to tell you. Well, they were being tricky because they took it off the network for about 3 months after the last first-run episode aired in March of 1968. They took it off until mid-June. So when everybody was writing in letters to protest the cancellation, they would get this form letter saying, oh no, it's returning to NBC. And so everybody thought, oh, it's not going to be canceled. No, it was returning for 12 reruns during September, July, and August.
That is tricky.
And by the time it returned, it was too late to do anything about it because the fall schedules were already set and Paramount was already selling the show into syndication. So they really were very clever about how to get rid of Star Trek. And if it wasn't the ratings, what was it? Well, we find out reading these books. You see all the fights NBC was having with Gene Roddenberry. You see poor Fred Freeberger in book 3 talking about how NBC wouldn't even return his phone calls. The network had basically closed the door on Star Trek. And Paramount was shutting the lights off at 6:20 at night. Even if they were in the middle of a scene, they would turn off the lights. So when you watch those third season episodes, it's remarkable that they are as good as they are, because they were cut back from 7 days to 6 for the second season. For the third season, they were cut back to 5.5, and they could not go into overtime. Their budget was cut. They couldn't afford to go on location. And so many people were just depressed over what was happening. So when you look at episodes of the quality of Spectre the Gun and The Empath, which was Gene Roddenberry's favorite episode, I think it's a wonderful episode. And Is There in Truth No Beauty? Fantastic episode. Especially that scene with Spock when he melds with Kodos, I think his name was, the ambassador, who was so ugly that he would drive you mad if you looked at him. And he's smiling and he's saying, and it's the ambassador talking, and he's saying this, how wonderful, I know all you people. I know you. But then he suddenly turns sad and he says, but how isolated you are in these bodies. How dependent you are on this thing called communication, this language, which is so inefficient. And I remember being 15 when I saw that the first time when it aired on NBC, and just being so overwhelmed by the statement, the sentiment of that episode. And of course, 15-year-olds feel so isolated anyway.
Yes.
So you're hearing that and you're going, wow, man, that's just great. And you look at Let That Be Your Last Battlefield.
Oh, God, yes.
I mean, how brilliant that is. I love that scene where Frank Gorshin is talking to Shatner. And Kirk says, you keep calling him his kind. His kind can't be trusted. His kind need to be, enslaved. His kind, blah, blah, blah. He's just like you. And he says, are you blind? His people are black on the right side. All of his people are black on the right side. We're white on the right side. And a lot of people think that's too simple. But listen, I was a teenager in 1968, 15, 16. And the stuff we're seeing happening now with a lot of police getting shot and so forth, that's nothing compared to 1968 when cities were being burned and the National Guard was being sent into city after city after civil unrest, both about war protesters and racial unrest and everything else that was going on. The whole country was coming apart at the seams. So to do an episode like that and make that statement in the middle of all this was just remarkable. All Our Yesterdays, another great episode from the third season. So, there's the Enterprise incident, Alana Troyes. There's some fantastic episodes during the third year, and with what they were going through, it's just remarkable. Anyway, back to your question. I'm sorry, I digressed. But the memos tell that story. So what I've done with book 4 so far is I've done all the other research. I've interviewed a lot of people, and I've got some more that I still want to interview. I've gone and found archival interviews for people who are no longer with us. I've gone and found all the stuff out of newspaper archives and Variety.com and all this stuff like I do, which gives us the reviews and the reports from the set and interviews from the set and all that kind of stuff. And I've interviewed Dorothy, and she's given me some memos from the animated series and things of that nature. And I interviewed a lot of the writers from the animated show and from the movies and so forth. The one rock I haven't been able to look under yet is Gene Roddenberry's private papers. And so we've contacted Rod Roddenberry to see if we can work out a deal to get access to Gene Roddenberry's private papers. But I'm confident we will. So what I've been doing is I've been building the whole skeleton of the book and adding the meat. You build the skeleton first, and then you start plugging in the meat. And the greatest part of the meat will be Gene Roddenberry's memos. So those will be the last thing I get. They'll be the last thing I get. But we're going to be very proactive to get a hold of those. But even if we fail, you're still going to be reading stuff that you never imagined and finding out stories that you didn't expect happened. And that's why I wanted to do the fourth book, is because when I was interviewing everybody for the first 3, I found out a lot of things that happened after the cancellation of Star Trek and before the start of Next Generation that I had never known. And things that were going on with Paramount and so forth. And it's really, there's a lot of behind the scenes shenanigans and a lot of conflict that was going on that was delaying the return of Star Trek, and a lot of false starts that where it almost came back and it didn't, and the reasons for all this type of stuff. So it's a very rich period of Star Trek history that hasn't really been fully examined. And we're going to do that with or without Gene's private papers, but we're doing everything we can to get those private papers.
Cool. So you mentioned new and archival interviews. Can you give us a little taste of who we might be hearing from in this new book?
I've talked to most of the cast of the original Star Trek about that period of time. A lot of the writers who were involved with both the animated series and Phase 2 and the motion pictures, and a lot of behind the scenes people and so forth. And I do have a lot of documents from those periods. And the archive, the reason I like archival interviews, I mean, I'll talk to everybody because I'll ask some questions they haven't been asked before. And I'll find ways to get them to remember. I'll give you an example of that. When I interviewed Frances Nguyen, who was Alana of Alana Troyes, third season, I went over to her house, we had tea, and sat down and started talking to her and tell me about this episode. I know you and Bill Shatner worked together on stage before then, so this was kind of a reunion for you and all that. I'd done all my own work. And she said, "Oh, Mark, it was so long ago. It was 45 years ago or whatever it was when I was interviewing her." And she said, I remember it was a pleasant experience. I remember it was great working with Bill again. I remember the costume was really interesting. I thought they did a really good job. I remember watching it, and I thought they did a good job. And that's really about all I can tell you. And I said, "Franz, did you know that the first day of production on that episode, well, first of all, I know that you were married to Robert Cope, and both of you were very involved with politics, and you were friends of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King and all that stuff." I said, "Did you know on the first day of filming that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated?" And the minute I said that, the the doors opened. The door to the memory opened up, and the memories started flooding out. She could see herself sitting in the makeup chair when somebody came and told her, because he had been shot at midnight the night before. And she had been in bed because she had an early call. And she got up and went to the studio, and she hadn't turned on the radio in her car. And she went into makeup, and she was sitting there, and one of the ADs came in, and he said, "Hey, Bobby Kennedy was shot last night at the Ambassador Hotel, shot in the head. He's in the hospital." And suddenly she was reliving the whole thing. And I said, because I had all the production reports, and I said, "Franz, the first scene you had to shoot was the one with Bill Shatner, where Kirk is trying to teach Elan how to eat with a fork and a knife instead of picking up the chicken in her hand." And she throws the knife at him. And I knew that, first of all, it was William Shatner, that the knife sells by his ears, not a stuntman, from the production reports. And you can tell if you slow down the DVD. He turns and looks back, and there's a little bit of a smile on his face, which worked because Kirk would kind of look back and smile at her and say, "You missed." But the reason Shatner had that little smile on his face was his kid, "Wow, it didn't hit me." But I said you had to do that scene. And she was remembering it vividly. And she was remembering, she was so happy to be working that day and playing this role, because every time they said action, she was able to escape the realities of the day. And every time they said cut, she would have to come back to what was really happening that day, country, and start sobbing. So I'll go through the production reports, and I'll find out whatever I can find out, and I'll find out what was happening in the news that day and whatever, and to try to stir their memories and get them to remember. But the reason I like archival interviews and going back through these newspaper archives, and I'll spend days and days and days, weeks, months sitting on these newspaper archives that I pay for, and just searching for anything I can find, because you'll get an interview on the set. And listen, 50 years plays tricks on the memory, but if you can find an interview of somebody on the set as they were filming, I mean, that's gold. So I do all that kind of digging, and I've done that for the fourth book. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff in the fourth book about the animated series, about Phase 2, about the difficulty in getting a Star Trek movie into production, about what happened with the Star Trek movie and the changes it went through and what went wrong. And I liked the first movie, but obviously things went wrong. And it's interesting to find out all that kind of stuff too. This is going to cover Wrath of Khan. It's going to cover the third and the fourth movie, right up to the day that Gene Roddenberry signs the contracts to do Next Generation. And there's a really interesting story about how that all came about too. So lots of good stuff in this book.
You gave a list of everything that's going to be in the book, starting out with the animated series. Are you covering the animated series in the same episode by episode format, really, as the previous book?
Yes. There's not a lot of memos, sadly, because it was an animated series. I mean, the actors all came in, but they could just read off the scripts. They're not on camera. But Dorothy was rewriting all the scripts, and she and Gene were picking all the writers. They brought in David Gerrold. They brought in so many of the writers from the original series. And I've interviewed David, and I've interviewed these different writers. But most of the conversations with the writers were done over the phone. Fortunately, Dorothy Fontana has a terrific memory, and so do a lot of these writers, because a lot of them were young. I mean, even David Gerrold was still very young when he was working on that show. And so they have very vivid memories about the work that they did. But you didn't have as many memos going back and forth because it's a whole different genre, what was going on. I do have a lot of memos from Phase 2. And Phase 2, well, first of all, I'm going to just give you a tease, a taste of some of the stuff in this. Okay, here we go.
All right.
We're getting serious now. So NBC wanted Star Trek back 1 year after canceling it.
Really?
Three things happened. they got rid of the show because they were constantly fighting with Gene Roddenberry, and Star Trek was breaking the rules of television. It was telling stories that you weren't supposed to tell. Stories about Vietnam, about sexism, racism, religion, overpopulation, Mark of Gideon, things like that. You saw Kirk making out with green-skinned women, all kinds of women.
Yeah.
You saw Mr. Spock trying to go home like a salmon swimming upstream to spawn. And you've seen the memos from NBC on all these episodes. The one where Kirk tries to rape his yeoman. I mean,
Yes.
NBC flipped out over that and refused to rerun that episode. It wasn't even happy about having to put it on the air the first time. So, and threatened not to. So they finally got rid of the show. Well, a couple things happened in the year or two after that. First of all, we go into the 1970s, and Archie Bunker flushes a toilet on All in the Family.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying words that had never been heard before on TV, and Norman Lear is pushing the envelope. And so suddenly NBC's thinking Star Trek wasn't so bad. I love that one memo on City on the Edge of Forever where NBC was fighting them because they didn't want Kirk to say, let's get the hell out of here at the end of the episode. And Roddenberry wrote to them and he said he just had to let this woman die. I mean, he's so distraught. He can't say, let's get the heck out of here. And this memo comes back from NBC, and the censor person wrote, oh, what the hell? Let him say it. I love that one. But they suddenly decided we can do these kind of shows now. Enough has changed just in a couple of years that we can do this now. It's not going to be a problem for us. We can have these mini skirts. It's not going to be a problem for us. We're seeing far worse on some of the other shows. So that had changed. Man had walked on the moon. Mm-hmm. In August of '69, Star Trek was still on NBC, but it was in reruns and it had already been canceled. So suddenly people's interest in space exploration had really taken off. And the network was kicking themselves. There was an interesting piece in a TV Guide article saying NBC is kicking themselves in the antenna for canceling Star Trek. So you have that happening. The big thing, though, is that a lot of stations are putting Star Trek reruns into prime time. And in every city where Star Trek is rerunning in prime time, it's killing whatever's on NBC and the other networks. It's getting a bigger audience than the first run episodes on networks. And so NBC finally cried uncle. And they came back to Paramount and said, okay, we want it back. And Paramount said, no, we're making too much money rerunning it. And if we give it to you, the bottom's going to drop out on the reruns.
Wow.
It wouldn't have, but that's the way they thought back then. Paramount could not imagine that people would watch the reruns if they could be watching new episodes. How stupid were they? They were the ones that were killing the show anyway. They didn't see the value of the show. Lucille Ball did. She put her studio on the line.
Yep.
The chopping block to back Star Trek because she said this show will rerun longer than I Love Lucy. She really believed it. And her board of directors said, Lucy, if we finance this show, we're going to go broke. We're not a big enough studio. We can't do a show like this. But she did it. They went broke. She had to sell to Paramount. Paramount came in, saw no value in Star Trek whatsoever.
Yep.
Here's something else in book 4. Paramount offers it to Gene Roddenberry for $200,000, which would be like about $1 million today. He already owned 25%. They offered him their 75% in Star Trek for $200,000. They had so little faith in it. They said there's only 79 episodes. How long can it rerun? So now it's rerunning, and it's doing great. So NBC wants it back, and Paramount says, no, ask us next year. So NBC comes back in '72 and says, okay, well, we still want it back. And Paramount says, you know what? You're not going to believe this. We're on more stations this year than last year. And the ratings are better this year than last year. But this can't last. It's a fluke. Ask us next year. Oh, by the way, the first Star Trek convention just took place in New York. Isn't this crazy? But come back next year and we'll give it to you. NBC comes back in early '73 and they said, okay, can we have it for the fall? NBC says, you know what? We're on now 150 stations across the country. The ratings are even better. Now there's 10 conventions scheduled for this year. This is weird. We don't get it, but it's growing. It's growing. Come back next year, and NBC said, "Come on, give us something." And they said, "Well, we can't give you an hour-long Star Trek because it'd be in competition with our repeats." They said, "Well, give it to us in some other. How about doing a movie? How about doing 1 or 2 movies every year?" And then somebody came up with the idea, well, we'll give you a half-hour animated version, and we'll get the original cast back, and we'll get Gene Roddenberry, and we'll get Dorothy Fontana, and we'll put the whole thing together, and that's how that came about.
Wow.
So it came about because NBC wanted the show back and had been trying to get it back for 3 years. Nobody knows this. They know it now. I just told you. But they're going to be reading about it in the book, and they're going to be reading the evidence of all this stuff and the people that are talking about it that were going through it. So the network is still trying to get Star Trek back. They've got the animated show. It's winning Emmys. They kept it on for 2 years. It didn't really do that great in the ratings because on Saturday mornings it was too adult for the kids watching. So they ran it for 2 seasons and took it off, but they wanted it back in prime time. So Paramount finally agrees to do it. But now they've got the idea, hey, why give it to NBC? Why don't we? And CBS wants it, by the way, too. And CBS says, we'll take it. No pilot needed. So you got 2 networks after them. ABC wanted it. But CBS and NBC were really proactive about trying to get it. And Paramount decides we can launch our own network with this. And so that they were going to put it back in production. Phase 2 was 2 weeks away from filming. They had 12 scripts written by some of the best Star Trek writers that ever worked on the original series. And the first one was going to be a 2-hour TV movie, and it was going to be called In Thy Image. You probably know that. You probably read about that. But we go into it in more detail. And I say we because I have my editor and I have the publisher who helps and everything else. It's me. And a lot of people, there's a lot of folklore about Star Trek. A lot of people said, well, Star Wars came out and they decided, well, we should do this as a movie. Not true. Paramount was having trouble getting their 4th network launched. Everybody wanted Star Trek. And the first people they went to were all the stations, and there were almost 200 at that point. 200 more stations than NBC had affiliates were carrying Star Trek reruns that year. Every year it was more. And they went to all of them and gave them first right of refusal on the new shows that Paramount wanted to produce. And they were only going to program 3 nights a week. And Star Trek was going to be on Saturday nights. And it was going to be their flagship. And everybody wanted it. Not a single station said no. They had 200 stations lined up to carry it. But the stations didn't want to carry all the other junk Paramount was trying to shove in the package. And so Paramount was really struggling. They had all the orders they needed on Star Trek, but they weren't getting what they needed on the other stuff. So they thought maybe we should wait another year. But Star Trek is so hot, and Star Wars had just come out, and so that's why they did the movie. So Star Wars did influence it, but the main reason was they were having trouble getting their network launched. And eventually they did, the UPI, you know. But and the flagship for that network was Next Generation. So this is all the stuff that happened. So here's a great story. I'm not going to tell you all the details because you got to buy the book, man. But get this: Star Trek is the #1 show in syndication in the U.S. It's the #1 show around the world in syndication. It's in 40 different countries. More than 40 countries. It's in 40 different languages. It's on 200 stations in the U.S., more than any of the 3 networks had as affiliates. This thing is huge. Conventions, merchandising, it just keeps growing, growing, growing. So they do the movies. Star Trek: The Motion Picture is the top box office movie for 1980. Came out in December of '79. The reviews were mixed, but it was #1 in the box office. Wrath of Khan comes out. It's a huge hit. Star Trek 3 comes out. Huge hit. But the reruns are still doing great. And Gene Roddenberry owns 25% of that. William Shatner owns 5%. And neither of them has seen a dime. And we're now into the mid-1980s. and it's been in reruns since 1970. So it's been in reruns for 15 years. And Paramount's saying that it hasn't made a profit yet. Creative bookkeeping. You may remember Robert Wagner suing Universal over Heart to Heart, and James Gardner suing his studio over the Rockford Files because they owned a piece of the action. These shows rerun for a decade, and yet they never got any money. I found out doing this Irwin Allen book that Irwin Allen, 15 years after Lost in Space had gone off the network, and it's the number one syndicated show that 20th Century Fox has around the world, and yet the studio's saying they haven't made any profit. So Roddenberry gets his attorney to look into the situation. And this is a great story, and I got this from people who were there. Gene was out playing golf, and this is like 1985. And he's out on the golf course with Paramount's top lawyer. And they get up to the ninth hole. And he says, let's make this interesting. The lawyer says, why don't we do it for $100? And Gene says, well, that's a little rich for me. Why don't we do it for something less? Why don't we do it for whatever Paramount owes me on Star Trek? By the way, how much is that? And the lawyer kind of looks around. This is what I was told. He looks around to make sure nobody's close enough to listen to hear him. And he kind of leans into Gene and he says, we figure about $30 million. Meaning we owe you $30 million. And so Gene gets home and takes the golf club to his walls and then calls his attorney and says, what are we going to do about this? And the attorney says, the problem is you don't have the right to do any forensic auditing. It's not in your contract. But Paramount wants to do a new Star Trek series. What if we negotiate a deal that we might be able to trick them into letting you do some forensic auditing on the first Star Trek series? He says, we'll give it a shot. So, and Gene's contract says that Paramount can't do another Star Trek series without his involvement. So Paramount's been dying to do a new Star Trek series. So they bring him in. They negotiate a deal. They sign contracts for Star Trek The Next Generation. They have all the press out there that's this big, big affair. Cameras are everywhere. And Gene walks over to the president of Paramount. The president says, well, congratulations, Gene. We're going to start off on another Trek. It's going to be a great one. This time you'll have your 5-year mission, all that kind of stuff. And Gene says, yeah, that's great. By the way, I'd like to see the books for Star Trek. And the president laughed. And he says, yeah, right. And he says, no, seriously, I want to see them. And he says, but Gene, we haven't made the show yet. There are no books. And Gene says, no, I mean on the original series. And he says, well, you don't have the right to ask for an audit on the original series. And he says, look at my new contract. And the new contract says that he has the right to ask for an audit. And the only title on the contract is Star Trek. It doesn't say Star Trek The Next Generation. It just says Star Trek.
Oops.
And oops, the next day, Gene had been wanting to get a Rolls Royce. And the next day, there's a knock on his bungalow at Paramount. He opens the door, and there's a guy there who hands him a key, and there's a brand new Rolls Royce out in front of his bungalow. And he says, this is a courtesy of a gift from Paramount Pictures, and here's a check for $30,000, and you'll be getting one of these each month and whatever, So that's why Gene agreed to do Next Generation, is because he had to settle up the business on TOS. When I heard these stories, it was like, okay, the story didn't end in 1969. The story of Star Trek TOS ended in 1985, early 86, when Gene Roddenberry was finally able to put closure on the whole thing. And that begat the birth of Star Trek The Next Generation. Believe it or not, Gene didn't want to do Star Trek The Next Generation. He was 70. He was not in good health. He thought it was a couple years too late. and he didn't know if he had the stamina anymore to do it. But it was the only way to put closure on the first Star Trek.
Amazing. That's an incredible story.
So those are a few little sneak previews of book 4. The stuff about Paramount not giving it back to NBC, about CBS wanting it, about what happened, and there's so much more. There's so much more. It's just, the story of Star Trek, as you found out from the first 3 books, as good as Star Trek is, and I think it's one of the best shows ever made, and all of them, created a whole universe of entertainment for us. But as good as they are, Jeff, the story behind the story is even better. I mean, what could be worse than a Klingon warrior before the peace treaty? Maybe a Paramount executive.
So, are you going to be covering the first 4 films in this book in a similar structure as you cover the episodes in the prior books?
Absolutely. And as I said, we're negotiating and begging and everything else to get access to the memos. I had all the memos. Gene Roddenberry gave me access to them. Bob Justman did. And then later on, a lot of this stuff was donated to UCLA, so I was able to go down there and do further research. But a lot of the stuff they gave me never even made it to UCLA. Same thing with the I Spy book I did. Same thing with the Lost in Space books I just did. The Shepherds of Lost in Space, Kevin Burns and John Jasny, who is president of Legendary Films. They're partners, and they are the shepherds of all the Irwin Allen properties. And they gave me complete access to all the Irwin Allen's private papers and all the memos and 400 pictures per book for Lost in Space and so forth. And they want me to do more books on Irwin's other shows like Land of the Giants, Voyage to the Sea, and Time Tunnel. And we'll see whether I have time to even do that. But that's always been the spine to my books is the memos. So we're really proactively going to try to get those by hook or by crook. But just what we have now, the stories we've been told and the documents we do have and the archival research I've done and everything else, it's still a very rich story. And it's never really been told to the degree that we're capable of telling it with what we have just now. But we're looking to get you those memos too, because I know they're fun to read, especially Bob Justman's. And Justman was there. By the way, they want me to do a book on the first season of Next Generation after this one.
Wow!
And I've already got the memos, including memos from Bob Justman because he was there for the first season. Wow. So we've already got all the goodies for the first year of Next Generation, and that would be the book to follow this book.
Oh boy, are we looking forward to more Next Gen books potentially after that? Are you teasing that?
I'm going to make that decision as I go along. I'm such a huge TOS fan that I knew I was going to cover the whole show where it took 1 book, 2 books, or 3. And when I committed to doing the Irwin Allen Lost in Space stuff, my commitment was to tell the whole story. And it's become a 3-book set because it goes beyond the end of that series through all the various cast reunions, the movie for New Line Cinema, the attempts to get the show back on the air, which included 2 pilots, one for CBS, one for NBC, one with the original cast, one with a different cast directed by John Woo, and now the new Netflix series, which is going to be coming out next year. So it tells the whole Lost in Space story with all the inside information and all the documents and all the inside players. I even interviewed John Jasny, and I said he's president of Legendary Pictures, and you know what they've done, the movie franchises they have. But just to be able to get him on the phone is a pretty amazing thing. So, and it's a remarkable story. And I wanted to tell that one because, people didn't know this. I didn't know it. But if it wasn't for Lost in Space, there wouldn't have been a Star Trek. People my age knew that Lost in Space came on a year before Star Trek. What we didn't know before I got into all the paperwork and the documents was that that's why NBC bought Star Trek. I mean, they wanted to do business with Lucille Ball. That's how they got involved. because they didn't want to do business with Gene Roddenberry. They'd already done Lieutenant with him and didn't want it. They wanted Lucy. She was CBS's Golden Girl. So they thought, we want to have a relationship with Lucy. But the thing that got them to finally say, okay, let's go, let's put it on the air, because they did 2 pilots, was that Irwin Allen put on Voice Above the Sea in September of '64 on ABC. And it was winning its time slot. It was a hit right out of the gate. And nobody thought you could do a science fiction series every week. None of the networks thought there was a mass audience. Outer Limits had failed, lasted a year and a half. Twilight Zone was on late Fridays on CBS and never really did good numbers. They kept it on because Rod Serling would win an Emmy every year for one of his scripts. So it was kind of a prestigious show for them, and it was on a night where they didn't expect to do a lot of business anyway. But they had canceled that. And nobody thought science fiction could really pull in a big audience. But Irwin went to ABC with the idea of doing Voyage, and he'd already done a movie, which had been a big hit. And he saved all the models, the miniatures. And he had 3 of them, 3 different sizes. The biggest one was 24 feet long. He saved all the sets, he saved all the props, all the costumes. He had a lot of stock footage that nobody had seen, that was left over from the movie. And he went to ABC and he said, I know you don't think a science fiction series can be made on a TV budget, but what if the sets are already built? What if the miniatures are already built? What if the costumes and the props are already paid for? What if we have stock footage of the big ship underwater and stuff that have never been seen before? What if I could bring all that to you for free? Would you want to try it? And so they said, okay. And it came on the air, and it's winning its time slot. It's doing great business. And so CBS comes to Irwin, because they had always won Monday nights until Voyage Above the Sea came on, and now they're losing Monday nights to ABC and the science fiction show. So they came to Irwin Allen, and they said, do one for us. And he said, only if you won't put it opposite Voyage Above the Sea, which was their plan. And so, but they said, oh, darn it. Well, okay, we'll take it and do a pilot. Well, Voyage had been the most expensive pilot ever made, over $450,000, which would be like $4.5 million today. And so 1 year later, he does Lost in Space pilot, and it's $550,000. On the day he starts filming the Lost in Space pilot at 20th Century Fox, just a couple miles away at Desilu, Culver City, they started shooting the Star Trek pilot.
Wow.
On the same day.
Amazing.
A couple miles apart. And the Star Trek pilot costs over about $700,000. So each one of these was more expensive than the one before, and money that nobody had ever seen spent on stuff before for TV. But CBS loved it. The pilot was incredible. It's Swiss Family Robinson in outer space, and so they went for it. It comes out in September of '65, and it's winning its time slot. So Irwin Allen has 2 giant hits on TV, and the only 2 science fiction shows on TV that are being made that year. And so NBC now has seen the second Star Trek pilot, and which they filmed while Lost in Space was making its first season. And they said, we got to get into the game. And so they approached Irwin Allen to see if he would do a series for them. And he said, no, because I've just sold a 3rd series to ABC called Time Tunnel, so I'm going to be producing 3-hour-long science fiction shows simultaneously.
Wow.
And nobody was doing more than that. Quinn Martin had 2 shows running simultaneously, The Fugitive and 12 O'Clock High. So Irwin knew, well, I can't do more than that. So NBC came back and said, okay, we'll take Star Trek. So it was because of Irwin Allen's success that they decided to do it, and it was because he wasn't available to come do a show for them that they decided to do it. Star Trek won by default. So it went on the air. When I was doing this research, the Star Trek fans will enjoy this story. I was like, Cushman, quit talking about Lost in Space. We don't care. When I was doing my research on Lost in Space, I found out that there's some information in one of my Star Trek books that isn't right. and there's going to be, obviously you can't be right on 100% of the time, even if you're interviewing the people who were there, because their memories could be wrong, or even if you're working off of documents from the time, because you can have documents that can contradict other documents,
Yeah.
And things like that, because things change. And maybe the document that got saved was the one that wasn't completely right. So there may be some things that are wrong in these books, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage, because we checked and checked and checked on everything we could. But there was a story that I believed of Gene's. He had told it so many times, and he told it to me, that he went in and pitched the first place they took Star Trek after Desilu agreed to get involved was they took it to CBS, because that's the network Lucille Ball had a relationship with. So they had first right refusal on anything she did, and it seemed like an easy sell because they loved her. She had their number one show on CBS, The Lucy Show. And so they took it into CBS, Gene Roddenberry and Oscar Katz. And Gene told this story many times. You've heard it, where he says they went in there and pitched it to all these CBS suits. And they asked him questions. They kept him there for an hour or two, and they asked him all these questions on how can you do a show like this on a TV budget. And he gave them all these answers. And then they said finally, well, thank you very much, but we have one of our own called Lost in Space. And so he left the room, and he was all very angry, and he said, how dare they? And da da da. And he's told that story many times in conventions. It's in my book when he told it to me, and so forth. Well, doing the research on Lost in Space, Irwin Allen didn't even bring Lost in Space to CBS until 2 months after Gene Roddenberry had his meeting there.
Oh.
CBS was interested. They had already contacted Irwin about doing a show. And the show that they wanted him to do was Swiss Family Robinson, to do a show based on the book Swiss Family Robinson. And Irwin loved science fiction. So he came back to them about 2 months after Roddenberry had his meeting, and he submitted a treatment that he wrote that was called Space Family Robinson, where he turned the story around. But this is 2 months later, and he hadn't even begun writing it. And there's even memos that I found between Irwin Allen and CBS from a couple weeks after Gene Roddenberry's meeting, where they're still talking to him about doing Swiss Family Robinson. So Gene didn't tell the truth. And I wondered why after I made this discovery. And I know why. Because he didn't want to admit that he had failed to sell it. His presentation wasn't good. He and Oscar Katz didn't do a good job. Herb Solow has said that. And Herb Solow came in and said, Oscar, you're not going back in with Gene to the other networks. I'm going with him. And Gene, come here. We're going to totally redo your pitch. And we're going to go into NBC with it. But you guys really blew it. But Gene didn't want to admit that he blew it. So it was much easier to say that CBS, those dirty, conniving, two-faced so-and-sos, already had a show of their own, and they just wanted to pick our minds. They had never, Lost in Space had never even been brought to them. And when it was brought to them 2 months later, it was called Space Family Robinson. So I wish I had known that. I wish I had done the Lost in Space book first.
Oh,
he fooled me.
Yeah. He fooled us all. That story.
The chat rooms will be buzzing about this now. Cushman got it wrong. I hear some of them dispute the ratings. I never go to these chat rooms, but some people will call me now and then and say, oh man, there's some people talking about you, and they say the ratings reports in your books aren't right, because one of them says he has a report from Nielsen that is different than the report you guys printed, or the numbers that you printed. They don't get that Nielsen ran 3 different reports on every show. They had their overnights, which was a 12-city, it was a 3-city report. Then a few days later, they had their 12-city report, which covered the same night, but it was a bigger survey. And the 3-city one was just a telephone survey. The 12-city one was a wider telephone survey, but it was also dealt with Nielsen families who were keeping recording logs in major cities like LA and New York and Chicago and so forth. And then about a week later, they had a 30 city report that came out for the same night. They did this for every night. They had these reports coming out where they had expanded their research. And then about a week after that, they had the national report coming out where they actually bothered to go into the farm communities and rural towns and smaller towns to find out what people are watching. Well, this is before the internet. It took a lot of knocking on doors and a lot of phone calling to penetrate that big of an area. So it took them 4 different reports to get a bigger picture of the ratings. So you get the overnights. A few days later, you get the 12-city report. Then a week later, you get the 30-city report. Then a week later, you get the national report. And Nielsen also had a habit of, during sweeps weeks, which were a 2-week period, they would combine the ratings from those 2 weeks and create a special report. So they would take the ratings Star Trek had, or any show, but we're talking about Star Trek. They would take the ratings Star Trek had for 2 consecutive weeks and then average them together. So they did that during the sweep weeks as well. So that's a 5th report. So the thing is which report are you looking at? Jacobs Brown licensed and paid for 1 report for every episode. And we got mostly 30-city reports, but for some of the episodes, we got 12-city reports. And then I went into dailyvariety.com and a few newspaper archive.coms, and I was able to get some overnights because occasionally they would print those, not often, and things like that. So there's a lot of different reports out there. And the information can sometimes be conflicting, but not by much. When I would be lucky enough to have a couple different reports for one episode, the numbers wouldn't change by that much. Usually whoever was winning the slot would still be winning the slot, but maybe the race would be a little closer. It's kind of like looking at the political polls right now. Does Hillary have a 6-point lead, or is it only a 4-point lead, or is it a 10-point lead? It all depends on which poll you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's that kind of stuff that goes on. And so, no matter how hard you try to be absolutely definitive with your information, things will always be disputable. But the one thing you can't dispute, looking at these books and looking at these reports that came straight from A.C. Nielsen, which we've kept them all in the files, is that Star Trek did remarkably well in the ratings compared to what we had been told for all those decades, and that was not the reason why NBC is trying to cancel it. You don't try to cancel your top-rated show of the night, ever. There's other stuff that's going on.
I remember when I started reading the first book, that was one of the things that really surprised me, was because you always heard those myths about how poor the ratings were. And I was shocked to see all the reports that you had in there. I was like, wait a minute, I always thought they were bad.
Nobody ever bothered to check. And you can't blame them that much because, first of all, look, my publisher had to put up $15,000 to get this on a book that you don't even know if it's going to do very well. I mean, that's a lot of money to spend for just one area of research. And I kept telling them, I said, this is going to be gold, you guys. I've seen a couple of these reports. You got to do this. You got to do this. And they're going, but can we just get a couple reports for the year? Can you give us a couple? I said, no, you got to have them for every episode, or else, they could say, well, that was a good week. How do we know what that means? You got to be able to show all the episodes. And we even went ahead and licensed some reports for some of the repeats because we wanted to see how big of a difference it made when TV Guide would do a half-page close-up listing. How much better that would do than the previous week. So we did some sample reports for some of the rerun episodes as well. But the only episode of the entire 3-year run that we weren't able to get a Nielsen report for was Wolf in the Fold from the 2nd season. They didn't have it. But when we tried to get these originally, I contacted NBC to see if they had any of the Nielsen ratings, and they said, no, we didn't keep that stuff. I contacted the Academy of Television and Radio over in Beverly Hills, and they don't have it. I contacted AC Nielsen, and I was told that they didn't keep stuff going back that year. They only had the top 20 shows for the season, at the end of the season. And there was 90 shows on the network back then. So you might have made 22 or 25 and you're still doing damn good. And they said they didn't have them. And about 6 months later, I called him back. I thought, how is this possible? You know, I mean, I know it's 50 years ago, and they're thinking, what do we need this stuff for? But it's history, man. Yeah. Again and again, I talked to somebody else, and they said they didn't have them. So I'd kind of given up. And then one day, I just was determined to try one more time. Three's the charm. And so I called back to Nielsen. This time I said it differently. Instead of saying, do you have the ratings from the mid and late 1960s? I'm specifically interested in one show, Star Trek, and that's what I said the first time. I called back and I said, I would like to license the ratings for Star Trek from the late 1960s. Oh, okay. Let's switch you over. Our licensing department.
There you go.
And I get somebody there, and they said, yeah, what do you want to license? And I said, these. Oh, really? Those? Oh, gee. Well, let me transfer you down to the basement. And they transfer me down to the bowels of A.C. Nielsen. I get somebody on the phone. I forgot her name. She was really very, very wonderful and very helpful. And I put her name in the book in the acknowledgments. She said, I know we got them. You know, I'll find them. And she went and found them. She called back. She said, well, how many do you want? I said, we want 79. Oh, really? She said, well, you know, they're $500 each. It's like, well, what if we get 79? What if we take some reruns? What if we take 90? Can you give it to us for a little less? And finally, they were able to negotiate a price. That's what ended up getting paid. So it was kind of a Costco run. We'll take the big box. Yeah. We'll take the super industrial strength box of ratings. So they had them, but it took 3 phone calls to find out that they had them, and a fair chunk of money. So for 55 years, anytime anybody was going to do a story on Star Trek for some newspaper or some magazine or Starlog, you know, they're not going to go to that much work, and they're not going to spend that kind of money. So they just went with the popular story that had come from the network back when it was trying to cancel the show. And that's how folklore gets around.
Yeah. I felt so out of touch when I read the ratings in your books and realized how wrong the stories that I believed for so many years were.
Yeah. Well, even individual episodes, like one I remember is in Paula Block's book, she said the same thing that was on Memory Alpha and StarTrek.com and all over the internet. She said that Let That Be Your Last Battlefield was an episode they were trying to do in the first season called Portrait in Black and White. They couldn't get it on. And they finally were able to get it done in the third season. Just Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Well, I've been through all the show files. No. Portrait of Black and White was written by Barry Trivers from a story from Gene Roddenberry, and it's where they beam down to a parallel Earth. And it's like pre-Civil War South, except whites are slaves and blacks are the master race. And the landing party is captured and put in shackles, and they're being sold as slaves. It was a pretty racy episode. And NBC said no, and they had a full script that Barry Trivers wrote, who wrote The Conscience of the King. And it was Gene Roddenberry's story. They had a full script, couldn't get it done, so during the second season, Gene Coon rewrote it under Gene Roddenberry's personal request and said, can you make this more palatable for NBC? And he rewrote it and couldn't get it done. And that's the end of Portrait of Black and White. The story of Portrait in Black and White ends right there. The following year, Gene Coon comes in to Roddenberry and pitches some stories for the third season. He's not producing the show anymore, but he's writing for it. And he wants to do this one called Heaven Above, Hell Below. And it's about these 2 aliens, one that looks like an angel and one that looks like a devil. And one's chasing the other, and the one that's being chased takes political asylum aboard the Enterprise. And the one that's chasing him is trying to say, give him up. He's a renegade. He's a criminal. I got to take him back to justice. And this whole story. And that's what the script was. And the week before they started shooting it, director Judd Taylor came in, and he's sitting with Fred Freiberger and Arthur Singer, and he says, oh, this devil and this angel thing is so, and we're going to find out that the guy that looks like the devil is not as bad as he seems, and the guy that looks like the angel is kind of a repressor, and he's not as good as he seems. And he says, it's too obvious. Can we do something else? And Fred Freiberger says, what? I'm probably telling you a story, because you read the book. But he says, what if he's half white and half black? And the other guy's half white and half black, but on the different side of his face. And Freiberger looks over at. He says, get me the makeup guy up here. He comes in. He's, can we do this? And he says, yeah. We can do it if we hire white actors because we can put black on them. But if we get a black actor and put white, it's not going to look as good. So it's not going to work. He says, okay. And we've already got the guy who played the Joker, Frank Gorshin, signed, and they had the other guy signed too. And Gorshin was going to play the devil-looking guy, which was perfect because he'd been playing the Riddler on Batman. They called Gorshin. They said, we know you've already done costuming and everything and makeup tests, but would you be okay if we change this and paint you white and black? And he goes, no, it sounds great. Okay. And so Freiberger and Arthur Singer start writing the script 5 days before it's going to go into production. They're working off of Arthur Heinemann's script and Gene Kuhn's idea. And they start rewriting the script as the episode's filming. So it's not based on Portrait of Black and White. It's an entirely different story, and it came about in an entirely different way. But I would see things like that on the internet, and I would see things like that in other people's books on Star Trek. And because nobody took the time to go through the show files. And it would just drove me crazy. So that's why I put all these memos in, because if I didn't put the memos in, people would just say, well, it's his word against this other writer's word. And, what if he's wrong and she's right or what? So let's put in the memos.
Yeah.
There it is in black and white, pun intended. So that's what you got to do. And that's why I write these books this way. Because, I love reading nonfiction, but whenever I pick up a book on something that I love or a performer that I love, I'm always surprised. It seems like the person writing the book hates that person and wants to tear them to shreds. And I think, why do you want to write a book about Alfred Hitchcock if you're going to try to make him sound like he's a pervert? Why do you want to write a book about Steve McQueen if you're going to try to make him sound like he's a brat? Why do you, and I'm just picking some people I've read books on. And why do you do that? I write books about things I love, but I write about them in a loving way. But I try to put in as much of their writing as I can, because I figure if you're a fan of Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry, what would you rather read? What Marc Cushman has to say or what Gene Roddenberry has to say? Let's get Gene Roddenberry's memos and read his words. Nobody can dispute it. Nobody can dispute it. And you're reading from the horse's mouth of the person you want to read about.
Exactly.
So that's why I do it in the style that I do it, which is actually, it's actually harder and it's more time consuming than just writing it yourself. I mean, I learned to write very quick as a scriptwriter, so I could sit and write these things a lot faster if I'm just using my own words. But to try to get all these memos and find them all and put them in order and then connect them and write in the clutch pedals and connect the dots is actually a lot more work. But that's the way I would like to read a book. So I'm hoping other people start doing it this way.
I hope so too. Speaking of Gene, there's going to be some material in this book about his pilots in the early 70s and his 71 film. What kind of information do you have?
A fair amount. And like one of the interesting ones was the Quester tapes. I've interviewed Dorothy Fontana about that one. And Gene Kuhn and Gene Roddenberry collaborated on that. They co-wrote that. And as a matter of fact, this was the last thing that Gene Kuhn did. He died before it aired. So it was the last job he worked on. And that proved there was no hard feelings between the two. And that's something else you find out in my books is why Gene Kuhn left the show. And you also find out why he wrote in the name of Lee Cronin during the third season. It had nothing to do with him being embarrassed by the work, like, again, the internet was alluding to. It was actually much more interesting than that. He was under contract with Universal. He was producing It Takes a Thief. He wasn't allowed to go work for Star Trek. and I love during Volume 3 of These Are the Voyages, when you're seeing the memos from Stan Robertson at NBC. And he says, like for Spectre of the Gun, he says, which was called The Last Gunfight when they were making it. And he says, Mr. Lee Cronin is writing this one. Well, let's hurry this one along and get the script done. We okay it. We approve it. Let's get the script done because we know how busy he is, and we want to get a script from him before he has to go back to his other commitments. But in the memos, they would always say Lee Cronin. They never said Gene Coon because memos can get copied, memos can get circulated, memos can end up on somebody else's desk.
Mm-hmm.
And Gene Coon was breaking his contract with Universal. And it takes a thief by moonlighting and writing for Star Trek. But it's the only way he could get out of Star Trek because he wanted to step down as producer, and Gene Roddenberry didn't want to lose him, so he said, "I'll let you step down as producer if you agree to do so many scripts next year if we get picked up." And so Gene agreed in order to get out of the contract because he was exhausted and they had a kind of not a real falling out, but a kind of disagreement about the creative direction of Star Trek. Gene liked doing humorous stories, and Gene Roddenberry wanted to keep it serious. So we find all that out reading these books. But so that's the only way he could go. So he's sneaking. He's really moonlighting. He's sneaking around writing these Star Trek scripts. But it's funny seeing the memos between NBC and Freeberger saying, "Oh, Mr. Cronin is writing this one." Well, that's great. A writer of his caliber. Who is he? He doesn't have any other credits. He's never done anything. Who's Lee Cronin? And they're saying a writer of his caliber. You know, it was code. Lee Cronin was code for Gene Coon. So they came back and they did the Quester tapes together. And I interviewed Dorothy about that, and she said it was a little rocky because even though they were still friendly, they didn't agree. Gene wanted Quester tapes to be a little funnier. He wanted to kind of get into the comical situations of this android, this robot, trying to mimic human behavior and things of that nature. And Gene Roddenberry didn't want any of that to happen. So Roddenberry came back and rewrote the script, and like he often did, and there was some hard feelings there, and Dorothy was a little bothered by about some things that got changed as well, and so forth. So there's always stories behind the stories, you know?
Yeah. Excellent. I'm so looking forward to reading that stuff. Is there anything that you want to talk about? Anything else you want to tell the audience about the fourth installment of the These Are the Voyages series? We're getting close to the end of our time together.
No, I think I told too much. I mean, you know, because the book won't be out until next August. We got to save some stuff,
Yes.
you know. But I gave you a couple tasty morsels there.
You definitely did. And I'm hoping that you'll come back again sometime in the future as we get closer to the book being published and talk a little bit more about it.
You got my phone. You got my phone number. You got my email. Just give me a yell, and we'll talk more. And I'll be more free to talk when the book's ready to come out and when I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Because I'll know more by then. It's like the first three Star Trek books. We didn't put the first one out until I'd finished all three. Now, when I say finished, I still had to do rewriting and editing and things like that. But you got to know the whole story. You have to have a first draft of the whole story before you can start putting installments out. You know. So I'm still in the process of discovery. And I will be for a few more months. I'll need to be done with all the discovery by the end of the year, and be finalizing the writing during the first 3 or 4 months of next year, or else I'm going to be in trouble. But I'm still at the point where I can be bringing in more information and doing more discovery. So I'll have more to talk about when it's ready to come out.
Excellent. So as we're closing up, I just wanted to ask you one final question that's not about the book. We have another series on the Tricorder transmissions that we call Shore Leave, and it's dedicated to the Trek convention going community. And I wanted to ask you about how your experience at the convention in Las Vegas was this past year.
Great.
Any memorable stories?
Oh, I mean, you know, I had gone to one of the very first Star Trek conventions, not the one in New York City in '72, and there have been a few after that, but I I went to one in San Francisco in 74 or 75. I can't remember which year it was. Not as a guest, but I was working for the company that was bringing in the films to screen. They were going to run several episodes, the pilot and a couple other episodes. And so I was the guy who delivered those episodes to the convention. And there hadn't been a lot of conventions, and there hadn't been a lot of press on the conventions, so I went in there and I was blown away, by the costumes and just the mood of it all and the energy of it all, and it was really cool. That was the first time I met Arlene Martell, and she was there to preen, and Walter Koenig was there, and George Takei and James Doohan. I got to meet all of them and even go to a party with them afterwards. So I was kind of in a nice spot for a guy who loved Star Trek, but he couldn't admit to it because I was there working. But then I didn't go to any for decades until August of 2013 when the first book came out. And my publisher sent me, we had a booth at the Star Trek convention, and I went. So that's the first time I'd been to one since 1974, 75. And it's really, grown. It's Mardi Gras. Well, you were there. You were there in a Gorn suit and a diaper. Well, that was a Santa bag. I'm sorry. So I went, and my publisher was there. Robert Jacobs was there, and he's, I don't know if he's ever even seen Star Trek. Probably a few episodes. He hadn't even read my book. He wanted the book. He thought the book was going to make $1 million. It hasn't, but he wanted it. But he had never been to a Star Trek convention, and I remember he came up to me like the first day we were there. He had been there before me. I flew in, and he came up to me, and he just looked like a kid in a candy store, and he said, I've never been around so many nice people in my life. So many positive, happy, nice people. And they're from all different walks of life. They're from all different countries. They're from all different income brackets. He said there's people here who are brilliant, who are millionaires, who are geniuses, who are just, you name it. And he was just in awe by the whole thing, out of the mouth of babes, right?
Yeah.
That says it all right there. I was in awe too, but I'd gotten a taste of it before, and I'd been a fan of Star Trek, so I knew the positive energy that Star Trek creates through positive themes of the stories. But going to Vegas, which I believe is the biggest one of the year, and we've been there for 4 years now in a row, and this last one was the 50th anniversary. So, they kicked out all stops. It was really incredible. And it's always fun because all the people I interviewed for the books, I get to hang with Barbara Luna and George, Walter Koenig, and all of them will come by and visit at the booth, and I'll have dinner with a few of them afterwards, things of that nature. So it's always, from a personal point of view, it's a lot of fun for me. But as a fan, and just as a spectator, I might be at the booth, but I got a ringside view of it all just going by me, and it's just a happy time. I would rather go to a Star Trek convention, a big one like in Vegas, than go to Mardi Gras or a carnival in Rio. And those things are pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But anybody who thinks that to be a Star Trek fan, I know they used to make a lot of jokes about it on Conan O'Brien and things like that before he went to Comic-Con and started finding out that they're actually pretty cool. They would say, what do you call a room full of 1,000 men without dates? A Star Trek convention.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? You've been there.
Yes.
Half the people there are women, and half of them are just incredible looking, and in costumes that are amazing, and it's just like lots of beautiful young women at Star Trek conventions, and beautiful young men at Star Trek conventions. It's just a cross section of all kinds of people, all different ages, and the different shows. You can tell by the uniforms. that they're wearing, which would show that they have their greatest allegiance to. But it's just a good time. That's all I can say. Anybody who hasn't been to one should go to one, but go to a big one. I mean, Vegas is always big, and it's always a good. And they always get the big stars to come out. Kate Mulligan and Jonathan Frakes and William Shatner and from all the different shows. Patrick Stewart. So there's always these great guest speakers to go listen to. But the costumes and the balls afterwards, you know, you go into any hotel in that area. And you go to the bar, and so there's a Klingon sitting there, and there's an Andorian sitting there, and a Ferengi, and it's just amazing.
Yeah, they're great times. And Mark, thanks so much for coming on the Tricorder Transmissions once again. Where can people find the 3 books that are already out and your Lost in Space book?
You can get it, of course, you can get any book at Amazon.com, and all the These Are The Voyages books are at Barnes and Nobles and places like that. But the best place to get them is direct from the publisher, because you're cutting out the middleman, so you get a better price, even better than Amazon, only by a couple bucks than Amazon, but a little cheaper. And those come autographed. And so if you want my scribbled ugly autograph, you can get it. And so whether it's Star Trek or Lost in Space or whatever I've done that Jacobs Brown has released, you can get it from Jacobs Brown at jacobsbrownmediagroup.com, or they've set up a sister site that is easier to remember, thesearethevoyagesbooks.com. And they even got an Irwin Allen's lostinSpace.com. So, but they're all linked together. So if you go to any one of them, you can get through a door and get to the other stuff. Excellent. And thank you for letting me do that plug.
Of course, Mark. And thank you so much for coming back on the show. It's always a lot of fun to have you on. I was so looking forward to talking to you about this, because our interviews are always so much fun.
What are you going to wear next year, Jeff?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't spilled the beans on that yet, but we have some ideas on the book, some more Gorn-related ideas. So there'll be at least 2 more Gorn variations, and I do believe that Santa Gorn will be making another appearance. Probably just once, though. Back by popular demand.
Santa Gorn was a hit. I mean, every head in the room turned when Santa Gorn walked by. And yeah. Did you hang with Bobby Clark at all?
Yes. I saw Bobby. I walked through that room, and he actually was not at his table. He was walking around the walkways between the tables, and I didn't see him. He grabbed me from behind, and he said, "You're wearing my head." So yeah, I did take a picture with him. He's a great guy. I'd seen him at the past conventions. I always love talking to him.
He is a really neat guy, and when I interviewed him for the first book for Arena, the episode Arena, I asked him. See, nobody asked him the things I asked him. I don't know if I'm just a degenerate or what, but I said, Bobby, how'd you go to the bathroom when you were wearing that thing? And his stories were great, weren't they? I mean, he got so serious about it. He says, it was really tough. They told me when I showed up on location, they said, don't drink any coffee, have a small breakfast, because once we put you in this thing, you're in it for the day.
Oh my God.
But it was so hot, he was sweating, so he had to be drinking a lot of water, but he would sweat most of that out. But he said at some point he had to take a pee. And he said, so he went over to the honey wagon, which is, the trailer with the bathroom in it that they bring out for the shoots. And there's a little metal ladder that goes up to it, kind of steps that drop down. And he just talked about the trouble going up that thing wearing those feet. And then when he got in there, he had to pull that thing down, the rubber, and get it all down so he could take a whiz. And his feet were so long that he couldn't get the door shut. So the butt of the Gorn is sticking out. So see, that's what you'll get if you get these books. You get to read stories like that.
Yeah. And many, many, many more I can attest to. Fantastic stuff.
All right, Jeff, it's been fun. I think I got to go to the bathroom now, telling you that story.
All right, Mark, you take it easy, and we'll be talking to you
By the way, how did you do it in Vegas wearing that Gorn suit?
Can I tell you?
Did you go into the men's room?
Yes, yeah? I did. But let me tell you, you wouldn't think it, but man, that suit was hot. I was drenched in sweat every time I wore it. By the time I wore it for the fifth time, I was able to extend my wear to about an hour and 15 minutes. That was about the most I could squeeze
Oh
out
yeah.
of it. And that was going into the men's room and pulling the mask off and standing there for a couple minutes, putting it back on and coming back out, just to cool off a couple times, because it was.
What I would have had to have done if I was you is I think I would have had to have driven across town, far away from the Star Trek convention, and go into a men's room wearing it in some other place. Just and step up to a urinal and look over at the guy next to you.
Yeah, someplace that's far enough away from the Rio that they don't know that it's the Star Trek convention, right?
Yeah. Go over to some snooty place where they nobody's even into it.
Yeah.
And let the Gorn go walk into the men's room. That would be killer. Next year.
Next year I'm going up to the Cosmopolitan.
And I'll go with you. I'll go with you, and I'll bring the camera.
Okay, deal. You got a deal.
All righty.
Thanks,
Talk to you later, man.
All right, take it easy, bud.
Okay.
Bye-bye.